Lewis Hamilton receives a 10-second penalty at the Canadian Grand Prix for exceeding track limits. Stay until the end to see the brutal clash between Lewis Hamilton and Frederic Vasseur for not warning him he was exceeding track limits. The Austrian Grand Prix came to a close with the sun setting gently over the Red Bull Ring, but the atmosphere within the Mercedes camp was anything but calm. The final results, announced nearly half an hour after the checkered flag had fallen, sent shockwaves through the paddock. Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion and one of the sport's most calculating strategic minds, had been retroactively hit with a 10-second time penalty for exceeding track limits multiple times throughout the race. The decision was brutal, cold, final. What had initially been a commendable effort marked by meticulous tire management, smart overtaking, and a defensive masterclass in Sector 2 was instantly nullified. His finishing position revised down, his points total reduced, and the entire emotional arc of the race for Hamilton wiped out with the cold press of a button. But what truly ignited the post-race firestorm wasn't the penalty itself, it was the way it happened. The retroactive nature of the punishment, combined with what Hamilton believed was a glaring internal failure from the Mercedes pit wall, created a perfect storm of resentment, confusion, and anger. The steward's official report outlined the reason for the penalty with clinical precision, stating that the number 44 car had been found in violation of track limits on multiple occasions at turns 9 and 10, locations notorious for drivers exploiting the exit curbs to carry more speed. According to the document, Hamilton had received a formal warning, and then continued to breach the limits without sufficient correction, which constituted a breach of the sporting regulations. Ordinarily, this kind of infraction is addressed during the race. Teams are usually hyper-vigilant when a driver receives their first or second warning, quickly radioing in with stern instructions to avoid a third. A black and white flag typically follows the third violation, acting as a final warning before a penalty is imposed. But Hamilton, according to team insiders and sources close to the debrief, never got that urgency. While vague messages about track limits were relayed, phrases like "watch turn 10" and "let's be mindful of limits," the tone remained passive, non-urgent, more suggestion than command. There was no explicit mention of an imminent penalty. No shout. No alarm. Nothing that made the threat real. And so Hamilton continued to push. Not recklessly, but with purpose, managing his tires with the delicate balance that has defined his career, defending from midfield threats and attempting to stay within DRS of the frontrunners. The data showed he wasn't gaining massive advantage through the exits, but the rules were the rules. For strikes and you're out. And Hamilton, unbeknownst to him, had just played his fourth card. The moment he stepped out of the car, the tension was visible. His face was a portrait of controlled fury, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. As he pulled off his gloves and helmet, his engineer approached, tablet in hand, trying to offer an explanation. "We'll go through it in the garage," was all Hamilton said, refusing to stop or slow down. He passed the post-race weighing station without acknowledgement, brushing off the usual protocol with a silent glare. A Sky Sports producer attempted to intercept him with a microphone. Hamilton didn't even look in her direction. His entire demeanor screamed betrayal, not from the stewards, but from the people on his own radio. And then, in one of the most unexpected and telling moments of the weekend, Hamilton made a beeline not for the Mercedes hospitality area, but for Ferrari's. Onlookers froze in confusion. Why would the face of Mercedes walk straight into enemy territory? Inside, Frederic Vasseur, Ferrari's team principal, was already in conversation with Carlos Sainz's engineer, but stopped mid-sentence as Hamilton entered. The two locked eyes. Hamilton didn't offer a greeting. Vasseur nodded silently and gestured toward a back room. No cameras were allowed. No team PR stood by. Just Hamilton, his fury still simmering, disappearing into the one place no one expected him to go. Whispers began immediately. Was he considering the future? Was this a symbolic gesture, a message to his own team? Or was he simply seeking counsel from someone he trusted outside the Mercedes inner circle? The fact that Hamilton had bypassed his own engineers, his own strategy team, and even Toto Wolff to walk directly into Ferrari's hospitality suite was as symbolic as it was startling. It wasn't just frustration, it was alienation. Inside Mercedes, panic started to ripple. Strategy chief James Vowles, now at Williams, but still connected closely to Hamilton through past campaigns, was reportedly messaged by 3 different team personnel asking for insight into how to manage the fallout. Toto Wolff, unavailable at the moment Hamilton entered Ferrari territory, returned shortly thereafter and was visibly tense upon learning what had happened. A closed-door meeting was quickly arranged in the Mercedes garage. Some believed Hamilton would skip it entirely. Meanwhile, in the media pen, other drivers were being asked about the penalty. Max Verstappen offered only a smirk and said, "You have to stay on the track, it's pretty simple." Lando Norris, with a more empathetic tone, commented, "Honestly, I think it's tough to judge from the car. Sometimes the feedback comes too late. I've had it before. You think you're good and then boom, penalty." George Russell avoided discussing his teammate directly but acknowledged, "Communication in these situations is absolutely critical. We're flying blind out there without clear info." When Hamilton finally emerged from Ferrari's hospitality over 20 minutes later, he looked calmer, but the edge hadn't softened. He gave no statements, answered no questions. Cameras followed him as he returned to the paddock's inner corridors, his steps slower now, more calculated, but no less intense. The debrief at Mercedes was brief, unusually so. Hamilton didn't raise his voice, but his message was direct and cutting. "If I'm going to be punished, I need to know when it matters. Not after it's over. That's unacceptable." The room fell silent. No one had an immediate response. That night, speculation spread like wildfire. Was Hamilton losing trust in his race engineers? Was this an early sign of deeper tensions within Mercedes? The team dismissed such talk publicly, calling the incident a procedural miscommunication. But privately, individuals close to the operation admitted the relationship between Hamilton and the pit wall had been strained since mid-season. Strategic disagreements, communication breakdowns, differing philosophies about risk and aggression, all of it bubbling just beneath the surface. And now, it had cracked wide open. Hamilton's silence in the media lasted into the following morning. When he finally addressed the situation via a carefully worded social media post, he refrained from attacking the FIA or directly blaming Mercedes. Instead, he spoke of accountability, clarity, and the importance of being in sync when fighting at the highest level. But the subtext was unmistakable. A warning shot. A quiet, pointed message to those who should have had his back when it mattered most. What this moment ultimately means for the future remains to be seen. But one thing is certain, this wasn't just about a 10-second penalty. It was about trust. About communication. About control. And once a driver like Lewis Hamilton begins to feel that the people in his corner can no longer see the fight from his perspective, the consequences are never just measured in seconds, they're measured in legacies. The atmosphere inside the Ferrari debrief room was suffocating, charged with a volatile mixture of frustration, disbelief, and sheer competitive fury. The moment the door closed behind them, the facade dropped completely. Hamilton, still in his race suit, ripped off his gloves with barely controlled rage, flinging them onto the table with a thud that made several engineers flinch. His breathing was rapid, the adrenaline of battle still coursing through his veins. For a split second, there was silence, broken only by the faint hum of cooling fans and telemetry data scrolling across unattended monitors. But then his voice tore through the tension, low but sharp enough to cut glass. "You left me out there blind," Hamilton said, eyes locked onto Vasseur with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "This is supposed to be the pinnacle of motorsport, not a guessing game. I asked you repeatedly where I stood with the stewards, and no one had the guts to be clear. You can't dance around that kind of information and expect the driver to magically interpret hints. I needed facts, not ambiguity." His words weren't shouted, but they echoed off the walls like thunder. The thin partitions between the debrief room and the adjacent strategy bay did little to muffle the rising storm. Mechanics glanced toward the door nervously. Even a few rival team members walking by outside slowed down, catching fragments of the confrontation through the noise. Vasseur, ever the cool head, tried to hold the line, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of calm. "Lewis, we gave you the warnings. 3 track limit alerts were communicated. You even acknowledged the second one. Acknowledging isn't the same as being informed I'm one step away from a black and white flag." Hamilton snapped, stepping forward, fists clenched at his sides. "You told me to manage the tires. You told me to hold George behind. You told me the gap to Lando. But you didn't once say, 1 more and you're getting a penalty. That's the part you left out. That's the part one needed." Someone in the room tried to interject, a junior race engineer, voice trembling slightly, but Hamilton's glare silenced them before they got more than 2 words out. The gravity of the moment was undeniable. This wasn't just a conversation about a race gone wrong. It was a moment of reckoning. A 7-time world champion, demanding answers in a place where silence had already cost too much. Vasseur took a breath, folding his arms, trying not to lose composure. The situation was fluid. We had race control updating us constantly. You weren't the only one caught out. 5 other drivers were pinged for the same thing. It was unpredictable. Unpredictable. Hamilton repeated, the word practically spat out in disbelief. I don't care if 10 drivers were penalized or 1. I'm not driving for Red Bull, or McLaren, or Aston. I'm driving for Ferrari. And I expect Ferrari to be 1 step ahead of the chaos, not part of it. That's the standard. That's what this badge is supposed to mean. He gestured toward the prancing horse stitched on his chest, the symbol that had meant prestige, legacy, and discipline. Now in his eyes, it was becoming a banner under siege. His voice dropped again, quieter now but no less intense. You don't understand what it's like in that cockpit. You're fighting off attacks, your heart's going at 180, your tires are screaming, and your mind's calculating strategy in milliseconds. I don't have time to interpret maybes. I need absolutes. That's your job. That's the pit wall's job. And today it failed. Vasseur remained motionless, absorbing the words. Around them, the rest of the team sat in awkward silence, caught in the crossfire. Some stared at their tablets. Others kept their eyes on the floor, hoping not to draw attention. A few shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, knowing that what was being said couldn't be undone or ignored. Trying again to salvage the discussion, Vasseur spoke, this time slower, more measured. We've already started reviewing the timeline. There were overlapping messages, some delays in confirmation from the FIA, and yes, maybe some miscommunication. But this wasn't negligence. It was a high-pressure, chaotic environment. We'll take accountability. No, Hamilton cut in, not with volume but with finality. You don't take accountability. You are accountable. That's the difference. That's what leadership means. If I lock up and lose a position, I don't get to blame the wind or the brakes. I own it. And if the team doesn't give me critical information in the heat of battle, someone has to own that too. Because it cost us. Not just a result, momentum, trust, confidence. He turned briefly, pacing a few steps across the room, his boots heavy on the floor, the tension following every movement like a shadow. His back was turned to the team now, but his voice remained as firm as ever. We're not playing catch-up anymore. We're supposed to be back. We're supposed to be contenders. But contenders don't crumble when the race gets messy. They adapt. They preempt. They communicate clearly. There was a long pause. No one moved. No one dared break the silence. It felt like the entire debrief room was suspended in time. Then Hamilton turned back to face them again, his expression no longer angry, but deeply disappointed. And that somehow felt worse than the shouting. I've driven for teams that made every second count. That treated each message like it could change a championship. I came here believing Ferrari could be that team again. But if we can't even get the basics right, then what are we doing? His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Vasseur didn't respond immediately. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because there was nothing he could say that would undo what had just unfolded. This wasn't just a frustrated driver venting after a tough race. This was a call to action, a wake-up call wrapped in brutal honesty. As Hamilton grabbed a towel and slung it over his shoulders, still drenched in sweat, he glanced once more around the room, not with anger but with purpose. Fix it, he said simply. Before it's too late. And with that he walked out, leaving a silence so loud it echoed long after the door closed behind him. After retreating to the solitude of his private space inside the Ferrari motorhome and allowing the searing pulse of adrenaline to slowly dissipate, Lewis Hamilton, still visibly simmering beneath a carefully measured exterior, pulled out his phone. He stared at the screen for a few long seconds, then tapped a number he hadn't called in weeks but knew by heart. It was a call not just for clarity, but for grounding. He needed to speak with someone who had seen him at his highest, guided him through his lowest, and understood the intricacies of his racing mind better than most ever could. The name on the screen, Toto Wolf. Toto answered on the third ring, his voice calm, steady, but alert. He could tell just from the timing of the call that this wasn't going to be casual. Hamilton didn't waste time. There were no greetings, no softened entries into the conversation. It was straight into the storm. Toto, he began, his voice already laced with exasperation. I wasn't pushing wide just for the thrill of it. The car was borderline unmanageable through the high-speed sections. The rear was stepping out. The floor was dancing on every exit. I wasn't trying to extend. I was trying to survive that grip window. And I wasn't gaining time. If anything, I was fighting to keep what little I had. Wolf, seated in his office at the Mercedes headquarters, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes as he listened, knowing exactly where this was heading. Louis, he replied gently but firmly, I saw the footage. I studied the onboard frame by frame. You were right on the edge every single lap, barely centimeters away from the line. It wasn't reckless. It was surgical. But from their side, the stewards aren't watching your telemetry. They're just counting white line breaches. And to them it's binary, you're either in or you're out. Hamilton's frustration flared. But that's the point, Toto. It's not about whether I crossed the line. I probably did. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is, nobody told me. Not clearly. Not in time. I was driving blind. You know what that feels like? It's like being told you've been disqualified for breathing too hard. I wasn't given the feedback to manage the situation. There was no clear warning. And by the time it came, I'd already crossed the final threshold. That's not racing. That's a broken protocol. Wolf exhaled, the sound soft but telling. You're talking about a failure in systems communication. Exactly. Louis snapped, not in anger toward Toto, but in passion for what he believed was a betrayal of racing logic. This isn't karting. This isn't a club race. This is Formula One. The pinnacle. Every data point we generate gets sent to the engineers in milliseconds, but somehow the most crucial piece of information, the fact that I was on my final warning, didn't get to me until it was too late? That's unacceptable. It's a structural failure, not a driver error. There was a pause, during which neither of them spoke, both processing the situation through different lenses. One as the driver in the car, the other as the man who used to manage the whole operation around him. Wolf finally responded. Louis, I don't disagree with you. You deserved better communication. But the FIA's getting stricter, especially at circuits like Spielberg. The Red Bull Ring is a magnet for track limit penalties because of those wide exits. You know the layout, it invites you to push. And the sensors there, they're ruthless. Hamilton scoffed under his breath, the bitterness hard to hide. Sensors, cameras, trackside hawks. And still, they can't distinguish between a guy genuinely losing the rear end and someone gaining an advantage. They claim it's about fairness, but it's inconsistent at best. Some corners have sausage curbs, others have AstroTurf, some just have a white line and a prayer. And we're expected to interpret all that at 280 clicks while managing tires, fuel, temps, strategy? It's nonsense. Toto didn't argue. The technology is advanced, yes. But the interpretation? Still subjective. Still reactive. And you're right, the inconsistency breeds confusion. Louis's voice softened just slightly, shifting from frustration to weariness. I can handle losing a fight. But I can't handle losing one I didn't even know I was in. If I'd been told, really told, that I was on the final warning, I would have adjusted. I would have backed off. Sacrificed a tenth or two. But instead, I was flying blind, assuming the team had it under control. Assuming the FIA had a feedback system that actually worked. Wolf leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk. It's not the first time, and sadly, it won't be the last. These races are becoming more about regulations than racing. We've both seen it. The spirit of competition is getting lost in translation. Yeah, Louis murmured, and the fans know it too. They don't want to see results determined by post-race paperwork. They want to see wheel-to-wheel action. But instead, we get races where a guy wins on track and then loses in the steward's room an hour later. And the worst part is, nobody knows what the actual rules are anymore. We're all just guessing. Wolf stayed quiet, letting Louis vent. It wasn't just about this one penalty, it was about an accumulation of frustrations. The kind that come from being in the sport for nearly 2 decades, watching it evolve in ways that sometimes defy logic. Eventually, he said, you still have time. You're still at the sharp end. You've still got what it takes to lead, on and off track. But you'll have to be louder about this if you want change. Lewis's response was immediate. Oh, I will be. Not for me, for all of us. For the next guy who gets burned without warning. For the fans who are losing faith. For the sport that's drifting away from what made it great. This can't go on. We've got to fight for clarity. For consistency. For the soul of racing. The call ended a few minutes later, but the conversation echoed far beyond those 15 minutes. It wasn't just a post-race debrief between old allies. It was the start of a movement. Hamilton didn't just want answers. He wanted reform. And from the tone of his voice, it was clear, this wouldn't be the last phone call he'd make. He later turned the spotlight back on his own garage, circling back with a tone that was sharper, more disbelieving than angry. The disappointment wasn't theatrical. It was raw, simmering just beneath the surface. Hamilton wasn't pointing fingers for the sake of blame. He was exposing a crack in the foundation, one that had been spreading since the early stages of the season. Standing with his arms folded and his eyes locked on his performance engineer, he said it again, not because he hadn't made it clear before, but because no one seemed to truly listen the first few times. This isn't the first time I've brought this up, he said, voice low but biting. When everything's happening in real time, when milliseconds count, we need more direct communication, no vagueness, no hesitation. I'm not asking for a dialogue. I'm asking for alerts, commands, warnings, and fast ones. We're racing teams that operate with military precision. Red Bull doesn't hesitate. McLaren doesn't second guess. If we're still trying to interpret situations while they're already making decisions, we've lost before we've started. If we're blinking while they're pulling the trigger, we're not winning. Simple as that. The room was still. Engineers nodded silently, some scribbling notes, others avoiding eye contact altogether. The discomfort wasn't personal, it was professional. They knew he was right. And perhaps what stung most was that the reality he spoke of had been felt by more than just Hamilton in recent months. There had been too many races where Ferrari had been reactive, not proactive. Too many near wins that crumbled due to slow calls, indecision, or internal miscommunication. Not long after, team principal Fred Vasseur approached to offer a measured response, but it was Mercedes' Toto Wolff, visiting the Ferrari motorhome for unrelated reasons, who caught up with Hamilton during a brief moment in the paddock. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Wolff, who had spent years guiding Hamilton to glory, knew better than most what made him tick. And in that brief exchange, while cameras hovered at a discreet distance, Wolff's message was precise and personal. "You've got Silverstone coming up," he said calmly, but with that signature steel behind his words. "You know what that weekend means for you. You know what that track does to you. Channel this. Don't let it burn you out. Use it. Take the fire and convert it into something untouchable. You've done it before." Hamilton didn't answer immediately. He looked away, eyes briefly scanning the grandstands now empty to fans. The adrenaline was still coursing, the sting of the penalty still fresh. But when he turned back, his voice was steady, quiet, but laced with something unshakable. "I'll use it," he replied, nodding slowly. "No doubt about that. But I've been in this game long enough to know one thing. I can drive through chaos, I can find grip in the rain, I can outsmart the grid. But I can't do any of that if I don't feel the team's got my back when things go sideways. And today..." He exhaled through his nose. "Today, I didn't feel that." He didn't elaborate further. He didn't need to. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a kind of subdued fog. Hamilton, normally a master of the post-race dance with the media, an expert at delivering just the right mix of reflection, frustration, and optimism, chose silence. No pit lane interviews. No press room debriefs. Not even a short comment for the team's social channels. Instead, he retreated into the engineering room, headphones on, sitting shoulder to shoulder with his performance engineer, eyes locked on the onboard replay from his car. Every throttle trace, every brake spike, every corner entry and exit was under scrutiny. He rewound turn 7 again and again, the exact moment the contact happened. He studied Norris's trajectory, his own steering input, the delta before and after. Not because he doubted himself, but because he needed to understand exactly how things slipped through the cracks. Not just with the move itself, but with everything surrounding it: the lack of a team warning, the absence of strategic foresight, the failure to respond assertively once the incident happened. He wasn't looking to assign blame, he was dissecting the anatomy of failure. Meanwhile, the Ferrari garage was unusually quiet. Even the normally chatty mechanics kept their voices low. Tools clinked softly, tires were rolled away without the usual banter. There was no laughter, no swagger, no music playing from the speakers tucked into the corners of the motorhome. The air was thick, not with fear, but with something worse: disappointment. Everyone could feel it. No one wanted to be the one to cross paths with Lewis unnecessarily. Not because he would explode, he wouldn't, but because the weight of his silence was heavier than any outburst. When Hamilton went quiet, it wasn't resignation. It was calculation. The 10-second penalty didn't ruin his race numerically, it didn't drop him out of the points or push him to the back of the field. But symbolically, it hit like a sledgehammer. It wasn't just about the final result. It was what it represented: another missed opportunity. Another moment when Ferrari wasn't fast enough, decisive enough, aggressive enough. Another race where it felt like Hamilton was running a marathon while dragging the strategy team behind him. In the corner of the engineering room, one of the junior data analysts leaned over and whispered to a colleague, "He doesn't trust us right now." The colleague just nodded. Because that was the truth. And rebuilding trust in Formula One, especially with someone like Hamilton, isn't about grand speeches or clever media lines. It's about execution. Consistent, bulletproof, ruthless execution. And that's exactly what's been missing. As the sun dipped below the circuit horizon and the last of the fans trickled out, Hamilton finally stood up from his seat, unplugged his headset, and gave a quiet nod to his engineer. He didn't say much, but his expression said everything. He would show up at Silverstone ready for war, not with the competition, but with doubt. He would come prepared to dig deeper than he had all year, not because the title was on the line, but because his name was. Because if the team couldn't rise to the occasion, he'd make sure he did. And everyone around him would feel that fire, not through words, but through every apex, every breaking point, and every moment where he refused to lift. Back in the bright, sterile confines of the FIA press office, where the air always seemed cold and the lighting merciless, there was no emotion, only procedure. The stewards, as they often did, worked quietly, clinically, behind closed doors, insulated from the fury that was already starting to boil just a few hundred meters away in the Ferrari garage. Their official statement came down like a gavel at a courtroom sentencing: precise, impersonal, and final. Car 44 was found to have exceeded track limits on multiple occasions at Turn 9 and Turn 10. Despite repeated warnings issued through official channels during the race, the driver failed to consistently remain within the white lines defining the track edge. As such, a post-race time penalty of 10 seconds has been applied to the final classification. There were no bold fonts, no exclamation points, no room for debate. It was typed in the standard FIA release template, buried beneath a long list of less significant notes: impeding in qualifying, unsafe release, minor infractions. But this one hit like a hammer. Because Car 44 wasn't just any entry, it was Lewis Hamilton, the 7-time world champion, the Ferrari marquee signing, the man brought in to change the team's DNA. And now, instead of headlines about redemption, progress, or resurgence, the narrative was veering off course. Within minutes, social media erupted. Screenshots of the steward's notice were already plastered across every F1 Twitter feed, every fan subreddit, every motorsport media outlet. Pundits argued over the footage, fans drew red circles around tire positions in freeze frames, and former drivers offered contradictory opinions on whether the warning system was flawed or justified. But inside the paddock, where the real storm was unfolding, the conversation was very different. Hamilton didn't issue a public statement. No tweet. No Instagram story. No comment to Sky, Channel 4, or F1 TV. But those who saw him, really saw him, didn't need words. His body language screamed more than any official response ever could. As he left the Ferrari engineering suite after the debrief, his jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. He didn't walk, he stalked. Every step had weight behind it, like he was dragging something invisible but unbearably heavy. His helmet still in hand, unpolished, visor streaked with smudges from a chaotic race, he bypassed reporters without so much as a glance. PR handlers tried to intercept, to offer a route through the back, away from the cameras. He refused. He walked straight down the corridor, right into the heart of the storm. Behind closed doors, the tension was volcanic. The technical director tried to frame the incident as a racing oversight, unfortunate but manageable, but Hamilton's stare cut through the room like a blade. "Manageable," he reportedly said, voice low but unmistakably furious. "Do you think champions get to this level by being managed? I'm not here to be managed, I'm here to win." The problem wasn't the 10 seconds. Not really. It was what they represented. Sloppiness. Lack of coordination. A system that failed to warn its own driver in time, or failed to demand he rein it in. It was yet another symptom of a team that had speed, had talent, had resources, but lacked clarity. Lacked steel. And Hamilton, who had built an empire on precision, discipline, and relentless execution, could feel the cracks widening beneath his feet. Mechanics, standing just meters away, kept their heads down, pretending to focus on packing gear, but every ear in that room was tuned to his voice. One engineer later described it as the loudest quiet I've ever heard. Hamilton wasn't shouting, but the emotion in his voice, controlled rage, disappointment, disbelief, made every syllable land with force. He asked for data. He asked why he wasn't told sooner. He asked how the same track limits violation that other drivers had avoided had become his downfall. No one had satisfying answers. In another part of the garage, Charles Leclerc sat with his trainer, speaking in hushed tones, glancing now and then toward the commotion on the other side. He hadn't seen eye to eye with Hamilton for weeks, but even he knew this wasn't just frustration. This was the kind of fury that signaled something deeper was breaking down. Trust, belief, cohesion. Even outside the garage, rival team members were talking. One Red Bull strategist was overheard saying, "You can feel it. Ferrari's about to explode." A Mercedes mechanic added, "That's not a penalty problem, that's a system failure." Ferrari's media team scrambled. The team principal was on the phone with Maranello, briefing executives before the inevitable headlines. Journalists were already sniffing for angles. Some framed it as another example of Hamilton's decline, past his prime, overreacting to a simple penalty. Others saw it for what it really was, a world-class driver, desperate to lead, clashing with a structure that wasn't yet ready to be led with his level of intensity. Inside the hospitality unit, Hamilton eventually sat down, not to relax, but to isolate himself. He pulled a cap low over his eyes and stared at a screen displaying lap data. Not just his own. Everyone's. Sector by sector. Corner by corner. While others packed up and congratulated one another or sighed with relief that the chaos was over, Hamilton was still racing, against himself, against time, against inertia. Those close to him knew this look. It was the same look he had in 2016 after losing the title in Abu Dhabi. The same expression he wore when the engine blew in Malaysia. The same cold intensity that carried him through the darkest hours of the 2021 title battle. This wasn't the look of defeat. It was the beginning of something dangerous. For his competitors, yes, but also for anyone who stood in the way of his mission. If Ferrari didn't act fast, decisively, and comprehensively, this would not be the last outburst. It would only be the first in a series of fractures that could tear the team apart from within. Hamilton hadn't come to Ferrari for podiums and PR victories. He came for titles. And if the operation around him continued to fail in even the smallest details, track limits, communication, timing, then he would either force it to evolve or burn it to the ground trying. The mood around the paddock shifted. Rivals whispered, journalists circled, and fans speculated. But inside Ferrari, no one was laughing. Because they all knew what had just happened wasn't about a 10-second penalty. It was a warning shot.